I'm on a mission to make friends with other YouTubers by crafting and sending them small versions of cool things that they've done. If you're on YouTube and enjoy camping, you've probably seen Steve Wallace. He's a favorite creator of mine who brings his viewers along on his creative camping adventures. The video that first introduced me to Steve was this one, stealth camping in a roundabout. Today, that's what I'm going to make. The first step was to find the actual roundabout, which wasn't hard because there's only one West Shore pet clinic on Google Maps. I was hoping for more of a challenge so I could break out some rainbolt-style sleuthing, but instead I had it handed to me on a silver platter. And in case there was any doubt about this being the roundabout, the location has 4.8 stars and over 60 reviews from other people who have also apparently stayed there. I first thought about doing this on location as a stealth crafting video, but none of the roundabouts near me have sufficient foliage to keep me hidden, and I didn't want to explain this to the police.
Yeah, so there's this YouTuber who does these stealth camping videos, and I was making a stealth crafting video for his stealth camping.
I made sure to keep Google Maps open as a reference for all of my shapes and spacing, which was helpful. And the landscape here is not very high, and it's pretty flat all around, so the perfect thing to use was some skinned Foamcore, which can sometimes be a bit stubborn. I cut the foam sheet down to the size of the gesso board, and I realize now that I broke the first or second rule of Christmas cookie making, which is to not use your cookie cutter right in the center of the rolled out dough. I was thinking that I needed to keep the big piece all together, which wasn't true. Luckily, I do have a crafting channel and will likely have future opportunities to use the large offcut, so it won't go to waste. I trimmed down and cleaned up the pieces of foam that I had just cut, and I glued them in place using some foam-safe super glue, so as not to melt them. While foam is very fun to work with and quite versatile, it can be a little bit sensitive. Like me. After the sidewalk, I put one more disc in the center of the roundabout, and it was time to coat everything in Mod Podge. This was to protect the foam from the coming layers of Tamiya putty and spray paint. If the putty and spray paint are applied directly to the foam, they have a pretty good chance of melting it just like normal super glue. A thin layer of Mod Podge goes a long way in preventing that. And speaking of putty, I grabbed some Tamiya Classic, which I diluted with lacquer thinner. Way too much lacquer thinner, I might add. After that had been mixed thoroughly, I stippled it everywhere that needed to have the texture of concrete or asphalt. Once that was done and all dry, it was time to prime the whole thing black and begin the painting process. And speaking of stealth mode, it was time to flip over my hobby mat to the side that's not afraid to get a little bit dirty. After masking the corners, somewhat needlessly, I took the whole thing outside and gave it another coat of paint. This time it was basically the same gray color that it was before the black coat. On top of that, I sprayed on some imperfect coverage of lighter grays, and finally went over that with a thin black wash, following the route that the cars would take around the roundabout. Speaking of roundabout, a word you'll hear a lot in this video, the song Roundabout by Yes has been one of my favorites ever since I was a little kid, long before it was used in a meme. I could have paid $200 to use it in this video. That's how much the licensing costs to use it in a video. Seems like a bit much, so I didn't do it, but maybe I'll regret that. I don't know. You know what? If you start the song Roundabout, the Fragile album version, the long one, at 9 minutes and 51 seconds or 52 seconds on this video, then the song and the glamour shots should sync up. And then you'll get the full roundabout experience if you'd like it. After all of the base colors of paint had been added with the airbrush, it was time to throw on some grime. I did this by mixing up an oil wash, which is burnt umber and mineral spirits. After the base had been covered in the oil wash, I dabbed it off with a paper towel, making sure it stayed in all of the corners, recesses, and hard-to-reach areas. I exaggerated the cracks on the circular concrete ring using an enamel pin wash, and once those layers were dry, it kind of faded a little and looked a little more natural. The next step was to plant some grass using static grass, static tack, and the static grass applicator, followed by a vacuuming with a vacuum covered by a sock to save all of the loose fibers, which is a very fun and satisfying process. With grass on all of the corners, it was time to do the landscaping in the center of the roundabout. I sprinkled on some dirt and dead vegetation-colored flocking, which I sealed with IPA and watered-down white glue. In Steve's video, he mentions there are some boulders that help him feel a little safer should a reckless driver decide to drive through the roundabout rather than around it. I added 4 molded plaster rocks from my collection, which were just the right size. After those had been glued in place, it was time for the plants. These boxes were all provided by Diorama Persepe, and this project was the perfect one for them. Using Street View as a reference, I began assembling a nice collection of bushes in the center of the roundabout that would be the perfect hiding spot for a secret little camping hideaway. Once the center had been fully foliaged, I added additional vegetation to the corners that needed it, and I pruned and trimmed all the little hedges till they looked just about right. With that, the gardening was done. The next step was to clean up my workstation and make some one-way traffic signs out of square styrene rods and little rectangles out of 040 styrene cut and sanded to the appropriate size. I used Street View as a reference for this build, and one difference between the current Street View and Steve's video is the color of these signs. In his video, they're yellow, which I went back and noticed later, but on Street View, they're white. So that is why the inaccuracy. After gluing the signs together, I stuck a piece of tape over top into which I cut the chevrons. The next step was to paint the signs, and off camera, I made a little Steve using Hero Forge, which had just the right clothing options for him. After creating the character, I scrolled through the pose options and I chose the appropriate sneaky stealth mode option. I made a little sack for him to carry all his incognito camping gear, and then I gave him and the signs a coat of black primer. And while I paint Steve, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. After the black primer, the signs were done. So I gave Steve an off-white zenithal highlight and some blue jeans, his black jacket, the skin and hair. And if you'll remember from his video, Steve stops at a hardware store, admittedly one that I had never heard of, to grab a high visibility vest before crossing the road to sneak into the roundabout. So I was sure to add the vest as well. And fun fact, this is the first high visibility vest that I have ever painted. And I think it turned out pretty well. So thank you, Steve, for giving me that opportunity. With that, Steve was done and ready to do some stealth camping. And I just want to say, if you somehow have not seen Steve's videos before, you should definitely go check them out. He seems like a genuinely cool guy. I brought the base back, was about ready to wrap things up, and as I was gluing the signs in place, I remembered that I was missing something for the bottom left-hand corner, and that was a large wooden sign. I looked the sign up on Street View and I noticed that it had a large typo. The R in center was placed before the E, which is crazy how nobody noticed that before they made the sign, but I'm going to be rewording it and changing what it says anyway, so it's not a big deal. I broke out some balsa wood and began assembling the sign. I impressed a little channel in the vertical wooden pieces to accommodate the styrene sheet that will be the signboard, which I cut and snapped out of 040 styrene. For the foundation of the sign, I used a piece of pink XPS foam, and I used a pencil to impress all of the stonework. After making the stone wall, I found some corrugated plastic sheets in my bits box which were just large enough to make the little sloped roof sections on the sign. I topped that off with a little styrene rod to finish the look. The last piece to make was the cement slab, which I cut out of Foamcore, and then I glued the whole thing together. After that, it was time to paint the sign. I primed it with acrylic from the airbrush so as not to melt the foam, which we know is pretty sensitive, and then I began adding the rest of the colors. And real talk here for a minute, Steve has been through a lot of hardship in the past few years. If you've seen his channel, you know what I'm talking about. And through it all, he has continued to make inspiring and encouraging content and kept putting it out on the internet, which I'm sure has not been easy. But I just want to encourage you, Steve, if you're watching this, that many people have been touched by your videos in a very positive way. So thank you for that. Keep on keeping on. With my sign done, I could glue that into its position on the grass. It was sitting up a little bit, so I hid the seam using more static tack and some static grass. The next step was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 4.0, and if this is too large to fit on a shelf, it could also be hung on a wall as kind of a fun piece of wall art. The last step was to glue Steve in place, and in his video I believe he entered the roundabout from this side, but I wanted him to be visible from this display angle, so I glued him here instead. After he had been glued firmly into position, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out to Steve for the inspiration for this video. Thank you again to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. Hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next time.